The Upswing, written by Robert D. Putnam. Summarized by detailed book summaries. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you did, welcome to our book family. Chapter 1. The Long Arc of American We. Robert D. Putnam's The Upswing. How America Came Together a Century Ago, and How We Can Do It Again opens with a bold claim that reframes how we understand American history. The story of the United States over the last 125 years is not a straight line of progress or decline, but a great curve. Around the turn of the 20th century, America began a long upswing toward greater equality, stronger community, and a more inclusive sense of shared purpose. Roughly 6 decades later, that curve peaked and then began to bend downward. Chapter 1 lays the foundation for this argument by introducing the idea of the I curve, a sweeping historical pattern that links economic inequality, political polarization, social solidarity, and cultural values into a single, interconnected narrative. Putnam begins by challenging the assumption that today's divisions are uniquely modern or inevitable. While many Americans feel that polarization, inequality, and social fragmentation are permanent features of contemporary life, history tells a different story. A century ago, the United States faced problems that were in many ways just as severe: extreme wealth inequality, corrosive political conflict, rampant corruption, and deep social distrust. The Gilded Age of the late 19th century was marked by vast economic disparities, exploitative labor practices, and a political system dominated by elites and special interests. The language of the era echoed many of today's anxieties: fear that democracy was being hollowed out, concern that society was breaking into isolated individuals, and worry that the nation had lost its moral compass. Yet, Putnam argues, something remarkable happened between roughly 1890 and 1960. America did not simply stumble forward, it deliberately rebuilt itself. Economic inequality narrowed, wages rose, and opportunity expanded. Political institutions became more responsive, civic engagement surged, and trust in government and in one another increased. Most importantly, Americans began to think and act more in terms of we than I. This collective orientation did not eliminate conflict or injustice, but it created the conditions for shared problem-solving and sustained reform. Chapter 1 introduces the core dimensions of this historical curve. Putnam identifies 4 major realms in which the upswing and downswing can be observed: the economic sphere, inequality and opportunity; the political sphere, partisanship and cooperation; the social sphere, community, trust, and civic life; and the cultural sphere, values related to individualism versus solidarity. What makes Putnam's argument powerful is not just that each of these areas shows a similar pattern over time, but that they move together. When economic inequality rises, social trust tends to fall. When politics becomes more polarized, civic engagement weakens. When culture celebrates extreme individualism, collective institutions erode. These are not isolated trends, they reinforce one another. To make this idea vivid, Putnam introduces the metaphor of the I curve. In the late 19th century, America was firmly in an I phase. Rugged individualism dominated cultural narratives, wealth concentrated at the top, and public institutions were weak or corrupt. During the Progressive Era, the New Deal and the post-World War II decades, the nation shifted toward a we phase. Collective action, mutual responsibility, and shared sacrifice became central values. Beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s, however, the country began sliding back toward a new I phase, marked by rising inequality, declining trust, and renewed emphasis on personal success over collective well-being. Importantly, Putnam does not romanticize the past. He is clear that the earlier upswing did not benefit everyone equally. Racial segregation, gender discrimination, and exclusion of immigrants persisted throughout much of the 20th century. The we of that era was often defined too narrowly. Still, Putnam insists that the existence of serious injustice does not negate the broader historical trend toward greater solidarity and equality. In fact, many of the era's reforms, labor protections, public education expansion, social insurance, and civil rights activism, were driven by the belief that society had a shared responsibility to address suffering and unfairness. Chapter 1 also addresses a crucial misconception, that economic forces alone drive social and political change. While industrialization, technological innovation, and globalization matter, Putnam argues that culture and norms are just as important. The upswing was not simply the result of economic growth. It was fueled by changes in how Americans understood their obligations to one another. Civic associations flourished, from labor unions and churches to neighborhood groups and voluntary organizations. These institutions did more than provide services. They taught people how to cooperate, deliberate, and see themselves as part of a larger whole. As the chapter unfolds, Putnam introduces the empirical backbone of the book. Drawing on decades of data, income distribution, voting patterns, membership in civic organizations, surveys of trust, and cultural indicators, he shows that the rise and fall of we-ness is measurable, not merely anecdotal. This evidence-based approach distinguishes the upswing from purely nostalgic or ideological accounts of American decline. The patterns are too consistent, across too many domains, to be dismissed as coincidence. Yet Chapter 1 is not only analytical, it is also quietly moral. Putnam frames the central question of the book not as what went wrong, but as what have we learned before? If Americans once found ways to come together across class, region, and ideology, then fragmentation is not destiny. History, in Putnam's telling, is a repository of practical wisdom. The past does not offer a blueprint, but it does offer proof that large-scale social change is possible without abandoning democracy or pluralism. Toward the end of the chapter, Putnam introduces a note of cautious hope. The downturn that began in the late 20th century has produced real harm: economic precarity, political cynicism, loneliness, and mistrust. But downturns are not permanent states. Just as the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era through sustained civic effort, today's challenges could give rise to a new upswing. However, this will not happen automatically. The earlier transformation required intentional leadership, grassroots activism, and a cultural shift away from pure individualism toward shared responsibility. Chapter 1 thus serves as an invitation rather than a conclusion. It asks readers to step back from daily headlines and see the longer arc of American history. By recognizing that the nation has moved from I to we before, Putnam sets the stage for a deeper exploration of how that transformation occurred and how it might occur again. The chapter leaves us with a reframed sense of possibility. The forces that divide society are powerful, but they are neither natural nor irreversible. Understanding the upswing is the first step toward imagining and building the next one. Chapter 2: From Gilded Age Individualism to Progressive Solidarity. Chapter 2 of The Upswing takes the reader back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries to examine where America's great transformation truly began. Robert D. Putnam argues that to understand how the United States once shifted from extreme individualism toward collective responsibility, we must first fully appreciate how fractured and unequal the nation had become during the Gilded Age. This chapter is not merely a historical background, it is a mirror held up to the present. The social, economic, and political conditions of that era resemble today's challenges so closely that the comparison feels unsettling and instructive. Putnam paints the Gilded Age as a time of profound imbalance. Rapid industrialization generated immense wealth, but that wealth flowed overwhelmingly to a small elite. Industrial tycoons amassed fortunes that dwarfed anything seen before, while factory workers endured long hours, unsafe conditions, and precarious livelihoods. Economic inequality soared, social mobility stagnated, and the idea of equal opportunity increasingly rang hollow. The dominant cultural narrative celebrated self-made success and personal ambition, reinforcing the belief that individuals alone were responsible for their fate. If one failed, it was assumed to be due to personal weakness rather than structural injustice. Politically, this intense individualism translated into dysfunction. Government institutions were weak, corrupt, and often captured by powerful interests. Patronage systems flourished, public trust eroded, and voter turnout fluctuated wildly. Politics was less about solving shared problems and more about advancing factional or personal gain. The notion of government as a collective instrument for the common good had largely withered. Many Americans viewed public institutions with suspicion or outright contempt, believing them incapable of fairness or reform. Social life mirrored these trends. Communities were fragmented, urban neighborhoods overcrowded and impersonal, and social trust was low. While voluntary associations existed, they were often exclusive, serving narrow interests rather than broad civic goals. The cultural emphasis on rugged individualism discouraged cooperation and mutual aid. People increasingly navigated life as isolated actors rather than members of an interconnected society. Putnam emphasizes that this was not simply a matter of personal attitude. It was a deeply embedded cultural norm reinforced by economic structures and political incentives. Yet Chapter 2 is not a story of despair. It is a story of awakening. Putnam carefully traces how Americans began to recognize the costs of extreme individualism. Journalists exposed corruption and exploitation, giving rise to investigative reporting that challenged the moral legitimacy of unchecked power. Intellectuals, religious leaders, and reformers questioned whether a society built solely on self-interest could sustain democracy or human dignity. This growing discomfort planted the seeds for a cultural shift. The Progressive Era emerged as a response to these conditions, not as a single movement, but as a broad, overlapping set of reforms driven by a renewed sense of collective responsibility. What unites these efforts, Putnam argues, is a gradual redefinition of the American we. Reformers began to see poverty, illness, unsafe workplaces, and political corruption not as individual failures, but as shared problems requiring collective solutions. This reframing marked a decisive break from the dominant I mentality of the Gilded Age. Economic reforms were among the earliest expressions of this new thinking. Labor movements pushed for fair wages, reasonable working hours, and safer conditions, asserting that workers deserved dignity and protection. Antitrust laws challenged monopolies, signaling that the concentration of power threatened not only competition, but democracy itself. These reforms were not merely technical adjustments. They reflected a moral argument that society had an obligation to prevent extreme inequality from undermining the common good. Political reforms followed a similar logic. Progressives sought to clean up government, expand participation, and make institutions more accountable. Measures such as civil service reform, direct election of senators, and expanded suffrage were grounded in the belief that democracy functioned best when citizens trusted institutions and felt included in decision-making. Putnam highlights that these changes required Americans to think beyond narrow self-interest and embrace a broader civic identity. Social and civic life also underwent a transformation. Voluntary associations multiplied, drawing people from different backgrounds into shared activities and causes. Settlement houses, community organizations, and civic clubs fostered cooperation across class and ethnic lines. These institutions did more than address immediate needs. They cultivated habits of trust, reciprocity, and civic engagement. Through participation, individuals learned that collective action could produce tangible improvements in everyday life. A crucial insight in Chapter 2 is that culture changed alongside institutions. Progressive reform was sustained not only by laws and policies, but by a shift in values. Narratives emphasizing mutual responsibility, social justice, and shared destiny gained prominence. Religious and moral discourse increasingly stressed compassion and service rather than individual achievement alone. Education reform reinforced these values by promoting civic education and public schooling as tools for creating informed, engaged citizens. Putnam is careful to note that this transformation was neither smooth nor universally inclusive. Many progressive reforms excluded or marginalized African Americans, women, and immigrants. Racism, sexism, and nativism coexisted with calls for solidarity. Still, Putnam argues that the underlying cultural shift toward collective responsibility created the conditions for later expansions of inclusion. The idea that society could and should correct injustice became a powerful lever for future change. By the end of Chapter 2, Putnam has established a critical lesson. The upswing did not begin with prosperity, it began with purpose. Americans did not wait for perfect conditions to act collectively. Instead, they reimagined their obligations to one another and built institutions that reflected that vision. Economic equality, political cooperation, and social trust followed, not automatically, but through sustained effort. This chapter reinforces one of the book's central themes. History is not driven solely by impersonal forces. Choices matter. Values matter. Cultural narratives matter. The shift from Gilded Age individualism to progressive solidarity shows that societies can change course when enough people decide that we matters more than me. As Putnam subtly suggests, the question facing contemporary America is not whether such a shift is possible, but whether the will to pursue it can be rediscovered. Chapter 3, Building the High Point of We. In Chapter 3 of The Upswing, Robert D. Putnam turns from the origins of America's collective awakening to its fullest realization. If the progressive era planted the seeds of solidarity, the period stretching from the New Deal through the decades after World War II represented the high point of the American we. This chapter explores how economic equality, political cooperation, social trust, and shared cultural values converged to create the most cohesive era in modern U.S. history. Putnam's argument is not that this period was flawless, but that it demonstrates what becomes possible when collective responsibility is deeply embedded in institutions and everyday life. The chapter begins with the economic transformation of the New Deal era. The Great Depression exposed the fragility of an economy built on unchecked individualism and minimal public responsibility. In response, Americans embraced a new social contract that recognized economic security as a shared concern. Policies such as Social Security, unemployment insurance, labor protections, and public works programs reflected a profound shift in thinking. Hardship was no longer seen purely as personal failure, but as a societal challenge requiring collective action. Putnam emphasizes that these reforms dramatically reduced economic inequality and expanded opportunity, laying the groundwork for decades of broadly shared prosperity. World War II further accelerated this sense of we. The demands of total war required unprecedented levels of cooperation, sacrifice, and trust. Citizens accepted rationing, higher taxes, and government coordination because they believed they were part of a common struggle. Military service brought together individuals from diverse regions and backgrounds, reinforcing a sense of national unity. The war experience, Putnam argues, did not create solidarity from nothing, but it strengthened and normalized the idea that Americans were bound together by shared fate and mutual obligation. The post-war decades carried this momentum forward. Economic growth was robust, but more importantly, its benefits were widely distributed. Wages rose alongside productivity, the middle class expanded, and social mobility increased. Putnam highlights that this period saw the narrowing of gaps not only in income, but also in life chances. Access to education, homeownership, and stable employment became attainable for millions. This broad-based prosperity reinforced trust in institutions and in one another, creating a virtuous cycle in which economic security and social cohesion fed each other. Politically, the high point of we was marked by a willingness to compromise and govern for the common good. While ideological differences certainly existed, they were less polarized than in earlier or later periods. Bipartisan cooperation was common, and major legislation often reflected negotiated consensus rather than zero-sum conflict. Putnam notes that political leaders of this era frequently framed their goals in collective terms, appealing to shared values rather than narrow constituencies. This approach strengthened democratic legitimacy and public confidence in government. Social life during this period was equally characterized by connectedness. Civic engagement reached historic highs as Americans joined labor unions, churches, neighborhood associations, parent-teacher organizations, and service clubs. These groups created dense networks of social capital, fostering trust, cooperation, and a sense of belonging. Participation in such organizations taught practical democratic skills, listening, negotiating, organizing, that translated into broader civic competence. Putnam underscores that these associations were not merely social outlets, they were the infrastructure of a functioning democracy. Culturally, the era was defined by norms that balanced individual aspiration with collective responsibility. Personal success was admired, but it was tempered by expectations of fairness, duty, and contribution to the common good. Public discourse emphasized shared national purpose, civic duty, and moral obligation to others. Popular narratives celebrated cooperation and sacrifice alongside ambition. Education systems reinforced these values by prioritizing civic education and social cohesion, preparing young people to see themselves as both individuals and citizens. Putnam is careful, however, to confront the moral complexity of this period. The we that flourished was often exclusionary. Racial segregation, gender inequality, and discrimination against minorities persisted, limiting who fully benefited from the upswing. Many civic institutions were closed to African Americans and women, and economic gains were unevenly distributed along racial lines. Putnam does not excuse these injustices, but he argues that the strong collective framework of the era eventually provided tools for challenging them. The civil rights movement, for example, drew heavily on the language and structures of shared moral responsibility that had become culturally dominant. A key insight of Chapter 3 is the interdependence of systems. Economic equality supported political moderation. Political cooperation reinforced social trust. Social trust sustained civic engagement, and civic engagement strengthened cultural norms of solidarity. This interconnectedness made the high point of we remarkably resilient for several decades. It also explains why later disruptions would prove so damaging. When one pillar weakened, the others followed. As the chapter moves toward its conclusion, Putnam subtly shifts the narrative tone. He notes that by the late 1960s, cracks were beginning to appear. Social movements, cultural upheavals, and economic changes challenged established norms and institutions. While many of these challenges were necessary and just, they also strained the existing balance between I and we. The chapter ends not with decline, but with tension, a sense that the very forces that expanded freedom and inclusion would soon test the cohesion that had defined the era. Chapter 3 thus serves as both a testament and a benchmark. It shows that high levels of equality, trust, and cooperation are not utopian fantasies, but lived realities in recent history. At the same time, it reminds readers that such conditions require continual renewal and adaptation. The high point of we was achieved through deliberate choices and sustained effort, not historical accident. By understanding how this era functioned at its best, Putnam prepares the reader to confront the question that looms over the rest of the book. Why did the curve turn downward, and what would it take to bend it upward once more? Chapter 4, The Unraveling of We and the Return of I. Chapter 4 of The Upswing marks a decisive shift in Robert D. Putnam's narrative. After tracing the rise and peak of America's collective spirit, he now turns to the long, gradual unraveling that began in the late 1960s and accelerated through the end of the 20th century. This chapter is not written as a story of sudden collapse or deliberate betrayal, but as an account of how multiple forces, economic, political, social, and cultural, slowly pulled apart the fabric of solidarity that had taken decades to weave. The return of I, Putnam argues, was not inevitable, but it was deeply interconnected. The chapter opens with changes in the economy that quietly undermined the post-war social contract. As globalization, technological innovation, and shifts in labor markets transformed production, the link between productivity and wages weakened. Jobs that once supported stable middle-class lives became less secure or disappeared altogether. Economic inequality began to rise, revering decades of progress. Putnam emphasizes that this shift was not only material but psychological. As insecurity spread, trust eroded. When people feel economically vulnerable, They are less likely to see society as a cooperative enterprise and more likely to focus on individual survival. Political dynamics mirrored these economic changes. Partisan polarization intensified, and the culture of compromise that had defined mid-century governance gave way to ideological rigidity. Political debates increasingly framed issues in zero-sum terms, portraying opponents as threats rather than fellow citizens. Putnam notes that this polarization was reinforced by changes in media, campaign finance, and political incentives that rewarded outrage over cooperation. As politics became more adversarial, public confidence in government declined, creating a vicious cycle in which distrust justified disengagement and disengagement further weakened democratic institutions. Social life, once dense with civic participation, also began to thin out. Membership in unions, religious organizations, and voluntary associations declined steadily. Neighborhood ties weakened, and social networks became more fragmented. Putnam revisits themes from his earlier work on social capital, showing how reduced participation in shared activities diminished opportunities for cross-class and cross-ideological interaction. Without these everyday encounters, stereotypes hardened and empathy waned. People increasingly inhabited social bubbles, interacting primarily with those who shared their views and experiences. Cultural values shifted in tandem with these structural changes. The language of self-reliance and personal achievement regained prominence, often framed as a corrective to what some saw as excessive collectivism. Popular narratives celebrated individual success stories while downplaying the role of institutions and shared effort. Putnam is careful not to dismiss individualism outright. He acknowledges its role in fostering creativity and freedom. The problem, he argues, arose when individualism became unbalanced, when it crowded out norms of reciprocity, obligation, and shared responsibility. One of the most striking aspects of Chapter 4 is Putnam's insistence that these trends reinforced one another. Rising inequality fed political polarization, which undermined trust, which reduced civic engagement, which further normalized individualistic values. This downward spiral did not require a single villain or conspiracy. It emerged from the interaction of policies, markets, technologies, and cultural narratives that collectively shifted incentives away from cooperation and toward competition. Putnam also addresses the role of generational change. The cohort that had lived through the Great Depression and World War II carried strong norms of sacrifice and solidarity. As newer generations came of age without those formative experiences, collective memory faded. This did not make later generations less moral or civic-minded, but it altered their reference points. Without shared national challenges that demanded unity, the sense of common fate weakened, making it easier for society to fragment along economic, racial, and ideological lines. Importantly, Putnam does not portray the unraveling of we as purely negative or regressive. Many social movements of this era challenged genuine injustices and expanded individual rights. The push for civil rights, gender equality, and personal freedom corrected exclusions that the earlier we had tolerated. However, Putnam argues that these necessary struggles unfolded alongside a broader erosion of shared frameworks for cooperation. The challenge was not the pursuit of justice itself, but the difficulty of integrating expanding individual rights with sustaining collective responsibility. As the chapter progresses, Putnam highlights how declining trust became both a cause and consequence of social fragmentation. Surveys showed that Americans grew less likely to believe that others could be trusted, less confident in institutions, and more skeptical of collective solutions. This distrust reshaped behavior, encouraging withdrawal from public life and reinforcing a mindset of self-protection. Over time, the idea of society as a shared project gave way to a more transactional view of relationships and governance. Chapter 4 closes with a sobering assessment. By the end of the 20th century, the United States had largely returned to an I phase, reminiscent in structure, if not in form of the Gilded Age. Inequality was high, politics was polarized, social capital was depleted, and cultural narratives favored individual success over communal well-being. Yet Putnam deliberately avoids fatalism. The purpose of this diagnosis is not to assign blame, but to illuminate patterns. Just as the earlier upswing emerged from a convergence of forces, so too did the downturn. And what has been made by human choices, he suggests, can be reshaped by them. This chapter prepares the reader for the book's final movement. By understanding how we unraveled, Putnam sets the stage for the most pressing question of all, whether a new upswing is possible, and if so, what it would require to restore a sense of shared destiny in a deeply divided age. Chapter 5, Reimagining We, How a New Upswing Can Begin. Chapter 5 of The Upswing brings Robert D. Putnam's historical journey to its most urgent and forward-looking question. If America once moved from division to solidarity, can it do so again? After diagnosing the long descent back into inequality, polarization, and social fragmentation, Putnam turns to the future, not with easy optimism, but with grounded hope rooted in history. This chapter argues that renewal is possible, not because circumstances are identical to those of a century ago, but because the underlying dynamics of social change remain strikingly similar. The lesson of the past is not nostalgia, it is agency. Putnam begins by dismantling the belief that today's problems are uniquely entrenched or irreversible. While technology, globalization, and cultural diversity have changed the context, the core challenges, economic inequality, political distrust, weakened civic life, and hyper-individualism, closely resemble those of the Gilded Age. A century ago, Americans faced concentrated wealth, corrosive politics, and fraying communities, yet they managed to reverse course. This historical precedent matters because it reframes despair as amnesia. The nation has solved problems of this scale before, not through sudden miracles, but through sustained collective effort. A central argument of this chapter is that no single reform can trigger a new upswing. Economic policy alone is insufficient. Political reform alone is insufficient. Cultural change alone is insufficient. What produced the earlier upswing was alignment across multiple domains: economy, politics, society, and culture. Similarly, a new upswing would require coordinated progress across all these areas, reinforcing one another in a virtuous cycle. Putnam stresses that waiting for one domain to fix itself before addressing others is a recipe for paralysis. Economically, Putnam calls for a renewed commitment to broad-based opportunity. He does not prescribe specific policies in detail, but emphasizes principles: reducing extreme inequality, restoring the connection between work and dignity, and ensuring that economic growth benefits the many rather than the few. Economic security, he argues, is not merely about material comfort. It is a foundation for trust. When people believe the system is fair, they are more willing to cooperate, compromise, and invest in the future. Politically, Putnam highlights the need to rebuild norms of mutual respect and institutional integrity. Polarization thrives when politics becomes a battle of identities rather than a forum for shared problem-solving. Drawing on historical parallels, he notes that earlier reformers did not eliminate disagreement. They learned how to manage it constructively. Electoral reforms, ethical standards, and civic education all played roles in restoring faith in democracy. The deeper task, however, was cultural, redefining opponents not as enemies, but as fellow citizens bound by a common fate. Social renewal occupies a central place in this chapter. Putnam returns to the concept of social capital, arguing that strong communities are not luxuries, but necessities. Voluntary associations, local organizations, and shared public spaces create the everyday interactions that humanize difference. These settings allow trust to grow organically, not through slogans but through experience. Putnam suggests that rebuilding social capital today may look different than it did a century ago, but the underlying function remains the same: connecting people across lines of class, race, and belief. Culturally, Chapter 5 makes one of the book's most important claims. The next upswing will require a rebalancing of values. The goal is not to abandon individual freedom or ambition, but to embed them within a stronger sense of mutual obligation. Putnam argues that societies function best when they honor both I and we, when personal success is celebrated alongside responsibility for others. Cultural narratives matter because they shape what people see as normal, admirable, and possible. Shifting these narratives is slow work, but history shows it can be done. A powerful element of this chapter is Putnam's attention to generation. He notes that major social transformations are often led by younger cohorts who experience the failures of existing systems most acutely. Just as progressive reformers and New Deal architects were shaped by the injustices of their time, today's younger generations are confronting inequality, climate risk, and social fragmentation firsthand. Putnam sees in this generational experience not inevitability, but potential, the raw material for a renewed sense of shared purpose. Importantly, Putnam resists the temptation to offer a simple blueprint. He acknowledges that the path to a new upswing will be messy, contested, and incomplete. Progress will likely be uneven, and setbacks inevitable. What matters is direction rather than perfection. The earlier upswing unfolded over decades, driven by countless decisions made by citizens, leaders, and institutions. Similarly, the next upswing would emerge not from a single moment, but from a cumulative shift in how Americans relate to one another. As the chapter nears its conclusion, Putnam returns to the moral core of the book. The choice between I and we is not abstract. It shapes real lives. Societies organized around extreme individualism tend to produce loneliness, fear, and instability. Societies that invest in shared responsibility create resilience, trust, and opportunity. The question facing America, Putnam suggests, is not whether it values freedom, but whether it understands that freedom is strongest when supported by solidarity. Chapter 5 ends on a note of earned hope. History does not guarantee a new upswing, but it makes one imaginable. The same nation that once bridged vast divides can do so again, not by recreating the past, but by learning from it. The upswing was not an accident, it was a collective achievement. And if it was built once through human choice, effort, and imagination, then it can, in principle, be built again. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you did, welcome to our book family.